I am actually a very typical, dull, boring Swedish scientist.
Just to give us an idea of how many published papers you had in your career.
I would say it's probably nearly 900 papers. I have been through all of the things, including death threats and so on. And then I asked them, how much more such type of fields is your body hit by today compared to like 30 years ago? The correct answer is that the allowed increase compared to the natural background is quintillion times. That's a 1 with 18 zeros behind. The immune system seems to first try to fight out the electromagnetic field exposures, but after some time it cannot handle it. It was just televisions, sets, and computer screens which were, I quote, safe. And still the cells in their skin reacted in the very same manner. The electrohypersensitive people, they were just post-menopausal women. That argument was killed when men came forward with the same symptomatology. We took rats, we exposed them to the very same type of electromagnetic fields, and with all due respect for rats, but you know, they don't listen to radio, they don't watch television, they don't read newspapers, and still they got the same reactions. They put the cell phone close to a beehive, and then the queen collected her worker bees, moved out of the beehive, and disappeared and never returned. At London meeting in 2002, it should be remembered that representatives of the different insurance companies and so on, you know, they all said, for them, it was not the question whether it was dangerous or not, the radiation. They knew it was dangerous. The only question for them was, in the future, who is going to pay for the party? And they didn't want to do it. Every evening, you know, I go down on my knees and pray to God and say, please, God, make me wrong. Because if I'm right and no one really is listening, that would be sad.
I mean, I can understand it.
And that's a good point.
Olle Johansson, welcome to Resilience.tv, which is my channel.
Thank you.
Please correct me if I'm wrong. You are an associate professor retired from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden and the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden.
Yes, that's correct.
I think it's fair to say that you are a very well-published scientist.
Oh, thank you.
Just to give us an idea of how many published papers you had in your career.
To be honest, I don't have a real count for today, but I would say it's probably nearly 900 papers of different nature. And this is actually something very important you touch upon now, because I had another career in science before coming into this area of adverse health and biological effects. And when I started my medical studies at the Karolinska Institute, and that was in 1973, I very quickly joined a research unit, and that was at the Department of Histology. And I didn't know, of course not, that they were the #1, probably in the world, I would say, within the field of neuroscience. The brain, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves, and how they guide us through reality. And it took me, and people don't believe this, but it took me 3 days to have my name on the first manuscript. And within a few weeks, I had my first science paper. And Science, together with Nature and a few other journals, are the top-notch scientific journals where scientists dream about being published. Most, of course, are never granted that honor. And for me, it became like, I wouldn't say an every month event, but it was very common to be published in the very best scientific journals, Science, Nature, Brain Research, Neuroscience, and so on. And this is important, and I'm not bragging in any way, because when I entered the new field, and that was at the end of the 1970s, regarding artificial electromagnetic fields, like from computer screens, cell phones, and so on, my opponents started to say that, oh, he is just a young amateur. He doesn't know anything in science. And, my curriculum vitae, my CV, was longer than anyone had. So that effectively silenced that kind of criticism. They realized that, wow, there are very few persons on this planet that has that kind of a publication record. And I want to give full credit to my supervisor and other collaborators. And one side effect was also, and of course, that's common at the Karolinska Institute, a very typical lunch guest or dinner guest would be a Nobel laureate. And we collaborated with a lot of Nobel Prize winners in physiology or medicine. So again, that kind of prepared me to be what I am. And I am actually a very typical, dull, boring Swedish scientist, extremely accurate with all the details. The word controlled studies means something to me.
You were not bragging at all. It's actually the reason why I wanted to invite you to the podcast, because there are issues with corporate science or corrupt science on the one side, and it's a real problem in many fields. In the fields of medicine, it is major, but also in the field of electromagnetic fields, health. And that's one problem. We could call that corrupt science. But on the other hand, it's absolutely true when people talk about conspiracy theories, for instance, they do exist as well. And very poor pseudoscience is also an issue on the other side of the problem. So you have conspiracy theorists on the one side, paid for scientists on the other side, and in all cases, it's bad science and bad information given to the public.
No science. I would say no science. Pseudoscience, that's a very good term, actually, depicting that it's actually not science at all. It may look very tempting. It's like making a cake using shave foam instead of cream. It looks the same, but it tastes horrible, And it's the same here. It looks very tempting with this pseudoscience. And I know it sounds very harsh, but I meet colleagues around the world, and I cannot for my life understand how they could have been given academic titles or even positions, because they don't know the basics at all about science theory, science philosophy, how to construct a controlled experiment, etc., etc., etc. Very few are called for that. I mean, you have to know your trade. It's a little bit when you meet a chef, and I love Gordon Ramsay, and some people even call me the Gordon Ramsay of science, which I find very amusing. And I like that kind of programs because Gordon Ramsay, he points to that, oh yeah, you can be a chef, but you can also be a lousy chef. And that's the same here. You can be a professor, but you can be a pretty lousy one. And that will destroy the reputation and trust in science. And I'm very proud of being a scientist. I want people to feel that we are like an academic corps of mental fire brigade soldiers. And when something is wrong in society, governments, parliaments, health authorities should be trustful in calling for us. Like when you call for the ordinary fire brigade, they will arrive on the scene and put out the fire. That's the same with us. We should really know what we have in the toolbox, use it correctly, and come up with the kind of data that you can rest upon for the day. As I said, maybe tomorrow you have to re-investigate the answer. You should always have an open mind, but be critical.
So let's be critical and let's dive into it. I guess for people who are not familiar with EMF, what are electromagnetic fields? I mean, what are those that will interest us in terms of their potential effect on health?
That's an important start, you know. When you start, for instance, with household electricity, that will generate both electric and magnetic fields, but they behave separately as so-called physical vectors. So you talk separately about the electric fields and separately about the magnetic fields. Then you increase the frequency, and then they will merge together to become electromagnetic fields. And then you increase the frequency even more, coming up to like cell phone communication in the gigahertz range. And then you can talk about electromagnetic radiation. And would you go even further, you would suddenly enter into visible light, for instance. You would come into ultraviolet light, X-rays, and alpha, beta, and gamma rays, and finally cosmic rays, which are the most high frequent ones. And the further up you go in this frequency domain, the more energy you will radiate, the higher the frequency is. And of course, from a general point of view, we would talk about, for instance, the light in a room being driven by household electricity. You would have a cell phone based on radio frequent or actually microwave radiation. You have a microwave oven where you heat your food, and so on, so on, so on. There are a lot of gadgets, and it's actually surprising to enter like a Swedish home because people often don't realize that their toaster, their baking machine, the ice cream machine, the refrigerator, and so on are driven by electromagnetic fields. They sort of talk in very odd terms about something in the socket or it's in the wall. A teenager said, "Oh, it's something in the wall." Oh, yeah, there are cables there. I know. So that's what it's all about.
So the ones we will probably focus on are the ones which have increased exponentially. I mean, our exposure to them has increased really exponentially, probably to many different of these fields, but particularly to those linked to smartphones, wireless, computers, etc. So
could I ask you
yeah.
say, actually, all types of electric, magnetic, electromagnetic fields and radiation have increased, and the one that has increased the least are power frequent magnetic fields, which is a long name for your household electricity. If you compare today's exposure in your home or your workplace with the natural background, the increase is only 100 million times. And that's rather small compared to the increase for the telecommunication radiation. And when I give lectures, I often start by asking the audience if they can imagine a society completely devoid of any electronics, electricity, digital systems, and so on, no radiation, no fields whatsoever, except for the third generation mobile telephony called the 3G. And then I asked them, how much more such type of fields is your body hit by today compared to like 30 years ago? Is it twice as much? Is it 3 times as much? One time there was an old man who said, no, it's much more. It's 100 times more today compared to natural background. And the audience went, oh, no, the authorities would never allow that kind of increase. But the correct answer is that the allowed increase compared to the natural background is a quintillion times. That's a 1 with 18 zeros behind. And in Swedish language, we don't really have any words for that. In English, maybe you would say it's a colossal increase or an astronomical increase, and some people say a biblical increase. Regardless, it's even for a scientist hard to understand that kind of an increase. And I heard a physicist once saying that if you instead would increase the outdoor temperature by a quintillion times, then not only Stockholm and Sweden would immediately burn, but the whole planet would just disappear in a ball of flames. Wow, yeah. I mean, these increases are just amazingly big. And that was the 3G. Then you have to add Wi-Fi, 4G, 2G, 5G, blah, 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 all the other things, you know.
So that's really a worrying metaphor, temperature versus electromagnetic fields exposure, which brings me to my next question, because we, as ordinary citizens, we just sometimes read about potential health issues or dangers of telecommunication radiation. So if I just make a list of what you can read about from times to times, every few years, there are fears about cancer, DNA damage, neurological damage, issues with fertility. I think those are the main areas that if you Google it, that you will find in a few minutes. So my first big question to you is, what are the identified harms and what is the evidence for them? And maybe what is their mechanisms of action?
Yeah, I will not dwell too much on this, but you mentioned, for instance, cancer, and then we talk about brain tumors. And as you probably know, already in 2011, the World Health Organization in Geneva in Switzerland, cancer classified all types of radio frequency fields in connection with certain brain tumors. The problem, though, and this is an ongoing debate, again, if you call the statistics around the world, asking them, where do I see an incidence increase, meaning more cases per year that is statistically significantly different? There are none. Like Sweden, which has been exposed at a very high level for a very long time, since the handheld mobile telephone is actually a Swedish invention by Östen Mäkitalo at Ericsson Telecommunication. There is a slight decrease in that kind of very rare brain tumors. So if you ask me if I would make a list like you just did, I would put cancer at the bottom. Well, actually, the question is, would I even enter it into such a list? I would have other things, and you mentioned a few, like fertility, where you can ask the same question: do we see any decrease in sperm cell motility, viability, morphology, etc., as they do when they expose sperm cells to mobile phone radiation? And yes, that's exactly what you see in the general population. So there you find reality and laboratory blending very well together, and even more so. And you didn't even mention that, but for instance, the impact on so-called pollinators like honeybees, houseflies, butterflies.
That's for later.
Yeah, where there is a dramatic loss. And again, when scientists have done studies, they have seen that these insects don't like the mobile phone radiation. And now I have to stop myself and just remind your audience that I am dull and boring, because many of these studies I would love to replicate, make again, because there are inborn question marks. There are things that they didn't really control for, and therefore I would like to remake them to see what is the actual culprit here, what is the problem. And one problem for sure, you mentioned in the beginning, I'm retired since the year 2017, and being retired is very nice, but it's very, very difficult to find funding for doing these kind of experiments. And maybe on top of that, having the science history in mind, there could even be forces out there. I hope they are not present, but there could be opposing forces saying, no, don't let that guy do any experiments, or don't let them investigate this, because then they might find out the real truth, being that the electromagnetic fields are hazardous to different organisms, cell types, molecules, etc. So I hope that people that listen to this and view this, that they will also check out our website, where you can donate if you want to. And I'm so thankful for every single pound, dollar, yen, ruble, whatever. No gift is too small, you know, and that's the only way we can survive. And we have recently done some very interesting experiments with pollinators, but we can come back to that later on.
Yes.
Or impact on the immune system, which also opens a door to the recent pandemic. Could it be that impacts, for instance, on bacteria and immune cells would lower our protective capability against viruses? It's just a wild hypothesis, but I see some papers that actually point to that, yeah, that could be very well so. And myself wrote a paper already in 2009 about the immune system. And to make a very long story short, the immune system seems to first try to fight out the electromagnetic field exposures, but after some time, it cannot handle it, and then quickly deteriorates and kind of start to leak. And the outcome is that you suddenly have different reactions of your body, including flus, colds, and whatnot. So, yeah, there are handles that would be interesting to investigate. But again, it's like going to the food store without money. Then you cannot buy any bread and milk. It's the same for me. Without the necessary money, we cannot investigate this. And that's stressful, actually, because I think there are very important lessons to be learned here before they actually become too late lessons.
So from listening to you, it seems like identifying specific health risks, syndromes, is difficult on an epidemiological level, but you do find a few, like the glioblastomes. Sometimes they pop up as signals, but none is very large as a signal, as an individual signal of safety. Yep. But on the other hand, what you alluded to right now are mechanisms of harms. So yeah. Maybe it would be more interesting also to talk about those. What are the potential mechanisms of harms? You mentioned the one on the immune cells. Yeah. Are there others?
Yeah. Before I enter that, I should just conclude and say that don't forget the media coverage. You being part of that too, of course, you know. And I just remember a big set of articles some years ago stating that there was an enormous increase in brain tumors, particularly in children, and the culprit should be their cell phones. But then when you looked at it, it turned out that it was just a normal variation. 1 year, they had 2 cases per 100,000 inhabitants, citizens of the UK, actually. And another year, it was 5 And of course, that's 2.5 times more, but you have to look at the actual figures. 2 or 5, that's just a natural variation. And they forgot to also state what happened after the 5. Well, then you saw a decrease again. It fluctuates up and down, and 2 or 5 is not a catastrophe, as the newspaper said. It's very unfortunate for anyone to get a brain tumor, no question about it. But we shouldn't inflate single cases, sounding like the whole world is on fire. Yeah. Then coming back to your question, which is extremely interesting, and there are different, should we say, models you can use. One model is, of course, normal healthy volunteers, people without any form of handicap or illness. But you can also use persons with a functional impairment or disability called electrohypersensitivity. And it's so odd that you interview me today, because yesterday I had a very rewarding conversation with colleagues in Australia and in Singapore, and they are investigating exactly what you're asking for. What could be the actual mechanism behind, for instance, electrohypersensitivity? And it goes back, and that's very honorable for me, because I was the first to point out that both electrohypersensitive persons have an increase, quite a dramatic increase, of so-called mast cells. And mast cells have nothing to do with telecom masts. It's a German word for being inflated, being big, being fat, you know. And these mast cells are the common denominator at the cellular level in our immune system for reactions that we call allergies, asthma, and other oversensitivities. And they contain the famous molecules like heparin and histamine. And when they are released, you get your allergic attack or asthmatic attack. And we saw this dramatic increase in electrohypersensitive people's skin. And we also made a fantastic study. And as in science, you are always prone to be, should we say, surprised. We should just do a setup, a control setup, before making an exposure study of electrohypersensitive people, putting them in front of ordinary household television sets and ordinary computer screens. But before putting the electrohypersensitive people there, we wanted to sort of role play using students, normal healthy volunteers. And of course, them not reacting, not feeling anything, they should not have any molecular or cellular reactions. So they were ideal to just check up all the details. And we did it exactly as if they would have been electrohypersensitive, meaning we took skin biopsies of their back before sitting them down in front of these computer screens and television sets, during the exposure, which was 8 hours, and also afterwards, including 24 hours afterwards. And then we looked in our microscopes, and just to sort of role play all the parts, to our enormous surprise, we found that, I think it was like, was it a third or half of them, had a dramatic increase of mast cells in their exposed skin without feeling anything. The only subjective sensation a few students reported was that it was boring to sit for 8 hours with their back towards these computer screens and television sets. That was it. But still, their cells had reacted, and they reacted in exactly the same way as they would have done if we had placed them in front of, for instance, an X-ray tube, in front of ultraviolet light, in front of radioactivity. But we didn't. It was just televisions, sets, and computer screens, which were, I quote, safe. And still, the cells in their skin reacted in the very same manner. So that led to that we had to write a separate report. And it took a very long time to get it published, because when we send it to different academic journals, they always came back and said that, wow, this is so interesting. We had no idea that you can be so psychologically deranged, so even your skin will react. And, you know, my English is not perfect. We wrote normal, healthy volunteers. The editors and referees read strongly psychotic patients. If that's the case in such a study, how many similar mistakes are made because of prejudice? You know, all Finns carry knives. No, they don't. It's just a prejudice, you know. All Swedes are dull and boring. No, they are not. There are exceptions, and so forth, you know. And I was very shocked, actually. And one editor, he went to a bizarre length by writing back, congratulating us to our fantastic findings, but he wrote that his journal was not the one that I should turn to, but he recommended the foremost academic journal in the field of psychiatry, namely the American Journal of Psychiatry. And of course, we didn't send it there. We continued sending it to regular, ordinary journals within the field of histology and histopathology. And eventually, the Journal of Cutaneous Pathology just said, wow, we have to publish this. But this journey took 6 years. I think it's probably the longest delayed time in science history. And I should not compare myself to J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter, but I learned some months ago that she was rejected 12 times before being published. We were rejected more than that, you know, but eventually we could publish this paper. And it pointed to that mast cells could be at least part of the mechanistic background. And therefore, I was very honored talking to my colleagues in Australia and in Singapore, because that's exactly the cell type they are aiming for. And they want to do detailed studies around that. Also looking at the molecular events like ionic channels that could open and close and maybe be the driver of the subjective sensations of an electrohypersensitive person, like redness, heat sensation, pricking pain, itch, and so on.
And what is the putative mechanism of harm when it comes to sperm count and sperm motility and fertility issues? Is it the same?
No, well, you know, this is also so interesting you bring this up, because the sperm cells and the egg cells, as you know, they should meet and you should create a new being. And if they don't work, there will be no new beings, no babies, no cubs, no litter, nothing. And, you know, it's hard to think about this, but it seems as if the immune system realizes how fragile this system is. And therefore, our testicles and ovaries are heavily guarded by the immune system. Heavily, heavily, heavily guarded. So they try to protect the progenitor cells before they are produced into sperm cells and egg cells. And to the outmost reach, you know, they do everything they can, because they realize in some philosophical way that if the sperm cells and the egg cells doesn't work properly, there will be no more immune systems. So they are egoistic in that point. They want new immune systems to be formed. And then the question is, of course, at the molecular level and cellular level. And the only thing I really can add, and there is so little done here, oddly enough, you know. We are trying, I say again, we are trying to get money, but it's very difficult. And one thing you can say is that if we go to the brain, there is something called the blood-brain barrier, which starts to leak when you expose it to mobile phone radiation. And as short as 1 minute and 5,000 times below what you are supposed to withstand. So it's a weak exposure. Of course, it's not weak compared to natural background, as we talked about before, but it's weak compared to the official guidelines. And in the testicles, you have a blood testis barrier, which is very similar. And if it leaks here, maybe it leaks down there. And trust me, being a neuroscientist by trade, you don't want any leakage up here and definitely not down in your pants. And so no way. And we cannot investigate these events properly. There has been very much work done on the blood-brain barrier, but nothing to my knowledge on the blood testis barrier, but it needs to be done, I would say,
And how does it, do we know how the blood-brain barrier is being jeopardized by the electromagnetic fields? Do we have the explanation for this?
Yeah, the blood-brain barrier is a so-called functional barrier, but it's based upon the so-called feet of the astrocytes in the brain. And astrocytes is a type of glial supportive cell. And maybe we're talking about ionic channels. Maybe it's a transport cross-membrane or something. We don't know. Okay. And this is also fascinating. When I gave lectures in science theory, I always concluded that the most common answer for a scientist coming home to his family being asked, okay, honey, what did you achieve today? The most common answer is, I don't know. Most of the things you investigate, no one else knows anything about, really. So we are moving the frontier of knowledge forward all the time, step by step. And I hope if you call me in like 50 years or 100 years, then we will have the final answer to that very important question.
So we do know that there is an effect on the blood-brain barrier, and we can imagine that it also could have an effect on other barriers in the body.
Yeah.
And we do know for sure also that there is an effect on the immune cells. That's been shown in laboratory. In terms of mechanisms, we do know these two things. Okay.
Yeah.
Are there others?
Just quickly coming back to the immune system, and I will talk about Sweden. It's quite a number of years ago where the incidence of allergies, asthmas, and other oversensitivities in children up to the age of 14 went over 50%. More than half of the kids in Sweden have some kind of allergy, asthma, or other oversensitivity. When I was a kid in the 1950s, I remember I went to school. It was 1,500 pupils at different levels. And one boy, I remember, had hay fever, runny eyes, runny nose, and he was the kind of bullied victim. No one called it like that at the time, but people would make fun of him. He was sneezing his nose and so on. But today, there would be like 800 out of the 1,500. So something has changed. And I'm not saying it's only radiation-based alteration. There could be a number of other culprits, but it is interesting to investigate. And again, the kind of studies I'm addressing here, they are really the kind of cookbook science types, and they are not difficult. They are very straightforward. They're easy to make in a controlled format and so on. But of course, I'm going on like a parrot about this. You need the economic muscles to really perform such controlled studies. One such study we wanted to do when I was at the Karolinska Institute is actually sort of the opposite. We wanted to take a small Swedish town called Ljungby, and I think it's like 13,500 persons living there. It's a small town, and we wanted to get rid of all kinds of radiation, radio, television, radar, telecommunication, etc., just for 1 or 2 years. And then we would investigate whether healthy individuals over time actually would start reporting an increased, a bettering of their health. We know already that just by removing cell phones, computers, tablets, and so on, the psychosocial health will increase. That's very well understood. But we also want to see, will there be other effects on illnesses, etc.? But we were not allowed to do this because, and I quote, it would be unethical to take away television and so on. And I still don't really see the ethics in it. And the thing we wanted to do was to increase the inhabitants' health. But it's still on the shelves in front of me. People don't see that, but I have shelves here with different project outlines. And I would love to do that, really.
So I think we also had to talk a little more about the electromagnetic hypersensitivity, because indeed, if we don't see things on the epidemiological level, on the macro level, we do see many weird things happening to specific people, what we would call in clinical science case reports or case series, and they have value in science. I mean, it's a specific type of study, and of course, we cannot draw conclusions regarding the whole population based upon case reports, but they are important, and these people can be considered as canary in the coal mines in a way. What happened to them could happen to us. That much is established. We are both humans, so if we face the same circumstances, unless they have a genetic vulnerability, it could happen to us as well. And so what is electromagnetic hypersensitivity? How frequent is it? What are the symptoms, etc.?
And don't forget, what will happen to them might happen to us, but you can also reverse and say, for instance, regarding fertility issues, what will happen to us will not happen to them because they will keep away from radiation exposure. And that could be a very successful avoidance behavior, which also would include people in very, very poor areas of the world which don't have the money to build and no reason to build telecommunication infrastructure and so on. So there could be surprising winners at the end of the game. Electrohypersensitivity here in Sweden is a fully recognized functional impairment or disability. So they are not looked upon as patients. They don't have a medical diagnosis. Their symptoms are in the International Code of Diagnoses, number 10, and now today number 11, but that's another thing. It's very interesting. You asked about the number we see, how prevalent is it around the world, and somewhere between 3% up to, in extreme cases, maybe 10, 11, 12, 13%. And if you make a calculation based upon the lowest number, the lowest prevalence number, you end up with 350 million people around the world could be electrohypersensitive. And as you rightfully said, by collecting history, as we say in the clinical medicine, and case reports, and that has been done for decades, you see that there is a general pattern. And the question is, of course, what is causing this? And here there are different theories and hypotheses. And again, we need to do much more studies. And as I mentioned before, like this Australian guy doing experiments on mast cells and other cell types could open doors of knowledge that are very important. And in the meantime, here in Sweden, you know, to be fully recognized as a functional impairment means that you are entitled to live an equal life in a society of equality. I didn't say that. These are the words of the United Nations. They have special Human Rights Act for people with functional impairments. And to achieve this, you need something called accessibility measures, like a wheelchair ramp or a kneeling bus for someone that has a movement disorder. And the same again here, for the electron hypersensitive, you need to lower the exposure so that they can enter all kind of official buildings, squares, streets, etc. And there is a common idea in accessibility measures, namely that the numerically big group of winners is actually everyone. And I used to tell a story that for many, many years, when I should meet my ex-wife in Stockholm, we always met more or less at the same corner of a street in the city center. And there you saw these faced-off sidewalks for people in wheelchairs. During all these times, I never saw a person in a wheelchair, but I saw a huge number of parents with baby prams, skateboarders, bicyclists, and so on, using the same accessibility measure. And going back to electron hypersensitivity, if we would lower the exposures down to the levels that they say are all right, maybe you and I will not have a fertility issue, no neurological damage, no illnesses caused by radiation. So it would be a win-win-win situation.
So just because some people have no idea what the symptoms can be, a common list is tinnitus, like ringing in the ears, headache, bleeding, internal bleeding in some cases, fatigue, vertigo, and cognitive impairment. Is that about it? The most common symptoms?
You're talking, I would say, except for tinnitus, the others are more extreme, I would call it. The debut is often in the order of 8 out of 10 would be in front of a computer screen. And, you can have a big computer screen, you can have a laptop, you can have a tablet, you can have a cell phone. It's exactly the same technology. It's just the size that is different. And very many people claim that, for instance, using a laptop or a cell phone, that's the starting point for their electron hypersensitivity. Initially, they don't even understand that it is the gadget that is causing the subjective symptoms. And the common ones would be from their skin. I would say in the order of maybe even 9 out of 10 would start with cutaneous problems like itch, heat sensation, redness, swellings, pricking pain, and so on. Sitting there in that situation, they would actually think, no, it's probably the detergent for my shirt, or is it the shampoo or the soap I use, or is it something in the room that is causing this problem? So they don't identify the electromagnetic field exposure initially. Actually, it could take quite some time before people do that. And the classical thing is that they would note that when they come home in the evening, it might be slightly better if they're not surfing a lot on their laptop or cell phone and so on. And then they see that they would need like the weekend to calm down the bodily systems. And when it increases in severity, maybe the whole vacation. And, Swedes are very lucky because we have a very long vacation. It could be like 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks long. But you need it to calm down your bodily reactions. And somewhere along this avenue, people start to think, could it actually be the laptop or the cell phone, or what is it? And from there on, they start to change their situation. And most people, they have a very shallow, slight reaction, and they could handle it with rather small accessibility measures. But for some, it becomes very handicapping. And for a few, they are really isolated from the whole society. They could move out into the forest, into a caravan, into a tent, some kind of hut, and they might have to live there for quite a long time. And on the internet, ironically enough, you will find excellent presentations around these issues, including videos and even movies. So there are material that you can watch if you're interested in it. And of course, it's not only the person that is afflicted, their whole family are afflicted. To have, for instance, mother or father or a son or daughter out in the forest 200 kilometers away, that's not a family life at all. And, here in Sweden, to live isolated, it's very simple because most of Sweden is forest. But it's difficult, like in the UK or in the Netherlands or Germany, or whatever, where you have human constructions everywhere, more or less, that could be difficult to find a calm place for you to live in. And I often call to help people to arrange something. And of course, one way to do it is to shield your room or your house where you actually live. And that's easily said, but technically could be very difficult. And above all, it could be very expensive. Here in Sweden, a person with a disability would get help. But in most other countries, they would need to pay the whole party for themselves, and they could cost, 25,000 British pounds or dollars, so it could be very expensive,
So it is widely admitted that it is an actual disability and it is not psychosomatic. We are past those accusations that you mentioned earlier, that it was, some people thought it was all in their mind. Now most international bodies do recognize this as a real syndrome.
I would say like this, I don't think we are past that. But, people in official positions, they learn to be what we nowadays call woke. You don't say bad things about Finns or Black people or handicapped and so on, because that would be the end of your career. But that doesn't mean that they don't think that it's all in their head. But historically, when I started to investigate this, very quickly, another side of the coin emerged, namely that the electrohypersensitive people, they were just postmenopausal women. That argument was killed when men came forward with the same symptomatology. And then the opponents said, okay, no, these are people that have a low level of education. They don't understand the modern society and they get stressed. And then they get physical reactions. It's nothing wrong with the computer or the screen. It's just in the head of people. Then professors, associate professors, assistant professors, lawyers, politicians, and so on came forward. The most famous electrohypersensitive person today is, of course, Gro Harlem Brundtland, a medical doctor, the former Prime Minister of Norway and the former head of the World Health Organization, being electrohypersensitive. It's difficult to say that she is not well educated. And therefore, the opponents quickly said, no, we meant the opposite. It's actually the persons with a high level of education, and they want to achieve so much. And when the computer doesn't work, the printer stops and so on, then they get very frustrated, and then they get bodily reactions that are not caused by the computer or the printer, but is caused by the stress within their mind. And that's actually a very demeaning way to address the other group with a lower level of education, as they not having any wants and needs and dreams, which they of course have. But they were serving these kind of, in Swedish we will call them bortförklaring, an explanation that is not an explanation, it's just a way to get rid of a group of people. But finally they came to a very interesting explanatory model, namely that it's actually your fault. It's what we call a mass media-driven psychosis. When people like you make programs or articles are written in newspapers and tabloids, then people start to think, that's interesting. I have that kind of symptoms too. Maybe I'm electrohypersensitive as well. Yeah, that's what I am. And I found that a very interesting explanation. But it's so easy to investigate, and we did it. We took rats, we exposed them to the very same type of electromagnetic fields, and they got the very same molecular and cellular reactions. And with all due respect for rats, but they don't listen to radio, they don't watch television, they don't read newspapers, and still they got the same reactions in exposures, being exactly the same as for humans, as the humans had. And that kind of, for all time, killed these excuses. People realized that, no, we cannot say that, and also people would claim that electrohypersensitive people try to milk the insurance system of money and so on. Rats don't do that, So it all falls completely apart, including also, of course, Pavlovian conditioning, etc., etc. There were so many models put forward. And one thing that struck me was that the medical doctors that had these explanations, they were basically always dermatologists. And again, with all due respect for dermatologists, if someone has some kind of delusional behavior, I wouldn't send them to a dermatologist for an expert opinion. I would send them to a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or something similar. But the latter ones, they never came forward and had that kind of blunt explanations. They kept actually silent. So there you are. And it's interesting from a human point of view. And I always tell people that electrohypersensitivity offers a lot of facets. And one of them is that they become a mirror of the lack of democracy. It's so interesting to witness, and you realize that there are so many other groups in society which we just flush away because, well, we have some reason and it's not science-based.
Yeah, I think they're inconvenient. I had the same reaction lately to the COVID vaccine injured, because whatever you think about the science, the evidence about the reality of their harms, the way they are being treated is both scientifically and socially completely unacceptable. And it's obvious. And I think in general, when people hurt in a way that is deeply inconvenient to financial interests and maybe to society as we want to see it, then they become excluded and disregarded, but it has nothing to do with basic ethics and basic sound science. So far, we know that exposure has grown exponentially. We know that there are credible mechanisms of harm. You took time to expose them. We also know that there are canary in the coal mines case reports on the electromagnetic hypersensitive persons. So we have examples of what can happen to some people when they are exposed. But we kept mostly to human health topics. I would like to switch to the animal health, which is an important one. So what is the existing evidence regarding the effects on animal health? Given that, for instance, we do know that bees population have been collapsing since like 2006 or something like that. And we do know that there are several potential causes for that. Some would talk about the varroa, some would talk about the global warming, some will mention pesticides, and some will mention electromagnetic fields. So regarding electromagnetic fields and animal health, what do we have in terms of proper evidence?
And that's a very important area you enter now. We have talked about one species up till now, namely the human beings, Homo sapiens, the wise man. And of course, there are 7.7 million other animal species and another extra million of plants, fungi, protozoa, and so on. So there is a lot of different organisms. And unfortunately, most of them are not very well monitored. They are there somewhere, and people don't pay any attention to them. And you point to the pollinators and other insects. As you say, there are a number of papers, but as I said before, I would love to replicate them because there are question marks. And also, as you pointed out, there are a number of so-called confounders, other reasons for a dramatic decline of honeybees, houseflies, butterflies, and so on. When you look around in the world, Sweden has actually survived very well. We have only lost a bit over 80% of the pollinators. In the United States in 2022, it was reported that more than 90% of the American bumblebees are gone. In Canada, sorry?
As compared to what year? What is being compared to?
That's a very good point. I'm not sure. I think they have data going back very far, actually, because pollinators like honeybees, bumblebees, and so on has been kept in domestic services for a very long time. So probably the beginning of the 1900s even, they had very firm data on this. Last year in Canada, more than 90% of the honeybees are gone. And therefore, we have done some, I would call it field experiments. You would see me here in Sweden crawling around on grass areas where I have a 10 by 10 square and in smaller squares, 1 by 1 meter, and trying to count the pollinators just to get an overall image what's going on. And the only thing I can say is it is a dramatic decline. Car owners, and I am actually, it doesn't look like that, but I'm a biker, so I go around on my motorcycle. And if I travel like 150 kilometers during a day, yeah, I could have one spot on my jacket from an insect which has collided with me. And I had an uncle, he is not with us any longer, but in the 1950s, when they did a similar journey, they would have to sort of scrape off all this mud of crushed insects. The same for car owners, trains, etc. A number of years ago, they took away the water buckets, the sponges, the rakes to clean the windshield because there is no need any longer.
I remember when I was a kid, it was the same. I mean, even in the 70s, we had to stop sometimes to clean.
There are so few insects, and I interviewed people and asking them at petrol stations, and they say, oh, that's a long time ago. We took them away, like 5 or 10 years ago. So something obviously has happened. And as you said, it could be Varroa viruses that is causing the decline, insecticide, pesticides. There could be the modern farming landscape, etc., etc., etc. But when you see these experiments that are published, it's very interesting to note that pollinators obviously doesn't seem to like being exposed to cell phone radiation and similar. And also don't forget that, for instance, the new 4G and 5G, the wavelength is in the order of less than an inch. And that's the size of a bumblebee, a honeybee, and so on. So they are body resonant to the exposures. And we, on the other hand, we are body resonant to 100 megahertz FM radio, and that's very easy to prove, but that's a sidetrack. So something definitely is worthwhile investigating. And as I said, I'm constantly, day and night, trying to persuade people. And, you know, being a Swede, you're very, how do you say, well-mannered. You don't get angry with people. But nowadays, I get a little bit pissed when I meet, for instance, parents refusing to hand over like $1 per year. And then I ask them, do you really mean that the money you don't want to give to research today is the same money that your kids and grandkids are going to eat in the future instead of apples and oranges? And then they look very bewildered, but they still don't want to support anything. So I am getting a little bit Swedish type pissed, you know. But we are doing our best. And last autumn, we went for a field trip to France. And it was the very same week that the Nobel Prize in Literature was announced, which gave me a perfect opportunity because I interviewed every person in trains, squares, coffee shop, trams, underground restaurants, etc. And my first question would be, have you read something by Annie Ernaux? And most people had not a clue who she was, you know, which is interesting in itself. And then it opened up for the second question. Do you know that there is a dramatic decline of pollinators in France? 100% knew that. Everyone. One young woman even burst into tears at the restaurant in a group of 20 people. And she said, sobbing, that she was so afraid she didn't know what her kids and grandkids actually would eat in the future. So that they were very well aware of. And then we came by train down to Lorient, which is on the west coast of France. And we went to a very small hotel where the receptionist, she was also the cleaning lady and the breakfast hostess in the very same person. And the very first morning, she said and announced that, please, all my guests, you have to enjoy the honey I'm serving today because this is the last autumn I can do it. The beekeeper has namely announced that the volume has decreased, so he can only serve his own family and relatives with it, no more to this hotel. And she didn't know, she thought we were tourists. She didn't know why we were there. And I could tell you, we froze to ice hearing her telling us the future being present already today. Then I went later on in January, February this year, down to West Africa. In West Africa, they have honey production and by a very famous type of honeybees, namely the African wild bees that are more known as killer bees. They're extremely aggressive and they chase away everyone, you know. And only men are allowed to collect the honey, and then the women would prepare it for eating it. And interestingly enough, they claimed, and I didn't dare to try to count the bees, you know. They claimed that they didn't see any reduction in number, rather the opposite, a slight increase, more honeybees than before, which made me happy. And of course, then you can ask yourself, what's so different with West Africa? Is it the presence or not of viruses, of insecticide, pesticide, or is it the rather big lack of telecommunication infrastructure? I don't know, but it's interesting to use these different models to investigate this. And, you know, being a mental fire brigade soldier, every evening, you know, I go down on my knees and pray to God and say, please, God, make me wrong. Because if I'm right and no one really is listening, that would be sad. And also as a mental fire brigade soldier, you want to be wrong. as the ordinary fire brigade, when they arrive at the scene and it's a false alarm, they don't cry and they don't curse or so. They are happy because they don't need to bring out all the equipment and no one is hurt. No house is burnt down and so on, you know. They are very happy for the false alarms, and so am I. I wanted to be a false alarm, but unfortunately, for every year, the number of papers being published around these issues is quite increasing, I would say, you know, and has surpassed the many, many thousands or even tens of thousands of academic papers in peer-review-based scientific journals. So it's very difficult today to just sweep away. It is there, and we need to investigate it further and also to act and react before it's too late. So, I mentioned bacteria. I should just quickly tell you about
before we switch to bacteria, I just want to about the honeybees. I know that you published a study. You will probably say that it had confounders, but it showed that electromagnetic fields close to the bees had the effect of turning them into some sort of panic mode in terms of the sounds that they emit. What can you tell about the evidence? What is for you the most convincing evidence that indeed maybe the drop in bees population might be caused by electromagnetic fields? What do you know exactly?
It looks as if, you know, in the wintertime, and this experiment was done in Switzerland, and Switzerland, as in Sweden, when it's winter, it's winter. So there's a lot of snow and very cold. And the honeybees and other insects go into hibernation over winter, meaning that they clump together, keep the warmth and so on. And it's easier if they are, for instance, in a beekeeper's hive, because then the beekeeper could also insulate the hive and so on. And if you subject them to exposure, and we had this study, but we also have other studies pointing to that cell phone signals, for instance, they will alarm the honeybees, and they would signal this alarm in a so-called piping behavior. They have a sound you can pick up with a microphone. And it seems as if they are annoyed. And one of the studies, not done by us, but by other scientists, a very simple study in the summertime, they put the cell phone close to a beehive, and then the queen collected her worker bees, moved out of the beehive, and disappeared and never returned. That's the kind of studies we would like to replicate. But of course, it takes economic muscles, as I said before, to do it. And also, we have a very good contact here in Sweden, where they are prepared to allow us to experiment with beehives. And of course, if they would lose such a group, that's an economically quite tough hit for a beekeeper, but they feel that this is so important, so they want to risk it, yes. So that's the thing, you know.
Are there other types of evidence? Are there some theories about mechanisms of harms when it comes to the bees? Because there is I would say, talk on the internet about a particular type of what's the name? A cell that is used for navigation that could be impacted by EMF, but I'm not sure how scientific.
No. Yeah, this is very interesting too, you know, and the best studies on that is actually in birds. Birds have the same type of navigation molecules and cells, which help them within the geomagnetic fields to navigate over long distances. When they arrive at the final area, they use terrestrial markers. So that's another thing. They will identify things like church towers, trees, etc., all the way down to where they want to stay. And some birds, as you know, they return to the same nest as they had last year. So they're extremely good in finding this. And when they expose them to electromagnetic field, man-made such, they will be confused. They will run off in the wrong direction and so on. And I have a very famous story. Many years ago, I was sitting in my office and I got a telephone call. There was a man and he said that he was calling from an island in the Baltic Sea called Öland. And in Öland, they have ornithological centers. And I didn't know where he called from. He just said Öland. He said that he was watching migratory birds approaching various types of telecom towers, antennas. And when they came towards these, they would turn around 180 degrees, go back, and then find a new trajectory and try again. And now they would go further out, and eventually they would pass the telecom towers. And he asked me if I heard about that kind of behavior and if it was scientifically investigated and so on. And then I said, well, one of the most famous in the world centers for migratory bird investigations are on the very island you are visiting, Öland, and it's at the south end, and you should call them. And then he said, it's actually from there I'm calling. So he was the expert, and I like the way he did it. He didn't prone me into thinking in any direction. He just gave me an open question, and then I realized, wow, they are observing something that is published in scientific papers when birds are subjected to exposure within laboratories, but they are calling from reality.
Do we observe the same kind of population drop in birds as in bees? I think so, but
yeah, fortunately, but here you can really talk about chain reactions. It could be an effect of electromagnetic exposure, yes, but it could also be that the insect foraging birds, they have nothing to eat.
Yeah.
And for instance, I think it was even this year, I got a letter from Canada, a very nice man, and he said that in his garden, he noticed an extreme lack of birds. And I said, could you please send me a list of the birds that you think have disappeared or been diminished in number? And he did, and I could immediately see that they all were insect-eating birds. So I said, this is the easy answer. They have nothing to eat, and therefore they are disappearing. In Sweden, you see it very clearly. And at the same time, don't forget that, for instance, seabirds go in the other direction. They are increasing in number for various reasons. So maybe it's more a matter of the availability of the food than of the electromagnetic fields, but we don't know yet.
Okay.
So,
I remember the name. It was cryptochromes, right? The name.
Yeah.
Of, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And what will be the best possible experiment to determine whether it's pesticides or varroa or electromagnetic fields when it comes to bees collapse? If you had all the money in the world, what kind of experiment would you set up to reach really some form of certainty about that?
Well, to begin with, I don't need all the money in the world. Science is actually very cheap. You need, of course, the support from the external supporters of various forms. But having the money you need to make a control experiment is not very difficult. But it takes staff, equipment, time, and of course, beehives. And the ideal would be to have independent exposures of different beehives that are genetically exactly the same, and with the same amount of exposure to insecticides, pesticide, viruses, etc., and then you add the exposure from the electromagnetic fields, and in an area where they are not normally exposed to them. And that might be easy to find in Sweden, but like in the Netherlands, the UK, Switzerland might be more difficult because there are much more condensed number of people and installations, cities, towns, villages, and so on. So I would probably go for something like that. And also, I would definitely like to split all the money you mentioned to also investigate the fertility issues with sperm cells and egg cells. That's very important. And with, how should I say, not to overreach here, but to get sperm cells are very easy. So they are easily found in society, and you can do different experiments with that. And also, of course, I would love to do further experiments on bacteria. We haven't talked about that, but if it's time, I could do that. I will go back to the year 2017. And this is one of many studies arriving at the same result. But I'm thinking about the American scientist Tahiri and co-workers who published a study where they have subjected ordinary bacteria you and I have on us and in us right now. And they were exposing them to the second generation old type GSM mobile telephony or super modern Wi-Fi router exposures. And to make a long story short, when they looked at the exposed bacteria, it didn't seem to happen very much, except for one thing. And this thing keeps me awake every night, because the bacteria became antibiotic resistant. The very same year, 2017, the G20 countries, without knowing anything about the science, they had a separate meeting in Europe about the fact that approximately 25,000 Europeans die prematurely because of antibiotic resistance in healthcare. It was calculated that worldwide by the year 2050, and we are 2023 now, around 10 million people would die prematurely or for the same reason.
But what could explain this?
Well, wait. If you take the G20 country figures and connect them to the results of Tahiri and co-workers, of course, the 10 million could increase to 8.3 billion people. Everyone would suddenly be at jeopardy. Mechanistically, people don't know. I have to be honest about that. And here you can do a lot of very interesting studies, of course. But going back to reality, you know, in Sweden, you now and then read about antibiotic resistance in healthcare, especially in the flyers of tabloids and so on. So I was well aware of that. Yes, there are problems with this, but I thought, well, I will call a relative who is an orthopedic surgeon. And I asked her, is this really a problem? Should I be alarmed or not, you know? And then she said, you are so naive. This is such a huge problem, but we are not allowed to openly speak about it. But someone must come up with a new type of antibiotics, because we are heading quickly towards a general antibiotic resistance, meaning that people, as we did at the end of the 1900th century, will start dying from a splinter in the thumb. And we as medical doctors can only watch and do nothing. So yeah, it's a huge problem. And she was not aware of the studies regarding 2G and Wi-Fi router exposures. So she got very interested in that, of course.
Has it been replicated, or is it alone?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of similar studies, indeed, yes. Okay. And also, I mean, mechanistically, is it something simple that could be changed? The frequency, the pulsation, the modulation, what is it that needs to be changed? Or do we have to actually switch off everything? We don't know. And in the meantime, the party goes on. When I go out here in Stockholm, which I will do after this interview, I will meet people, and Swedes are dull and boring double time, because all of them, except me, they are going like this. They're only interested in the smartphone. And so they are exposing themselves and their kids and their dogs and cats and so on. Talking about dogs, by the way, I just recently heard from a veterinarian scientist that now they see a decrease in sperm cell quality also in domestic dogs. Of course, there could be other culprits, but the interesting part was that, our pet animals, livestock, wild animals, again, most people just take it for granted that they are somewhere out there. I get milk in the store. They are somewhere out there. Someone has a dog, someone has a cat, and there are birds and blah, blah. But maybe they are at jeopardy, all of them.
So there are just a few quick topics that I would like to cover. One is very simple because it's been talked a lot, again, with all the excesses on both sides. But is 5G extremely different from the other bandwidth? Is it potentially more harmful or not? What about it? What about 5G?
5G definitely from a technical aspect is different. And from an exposure point of view, on average, you will be less exposed. But when you read all these alarming headlines, you get a feeling that you will be fried and cooked. You are already fried and cooked from a microwave point of view, in the sense that, as you say, it will be the same type of frequencies, but they will be delivered in a different way. And so far, it doesn't seem to have a huge impact on the general population. But as we said just now, there could be an effect sneaking up on you via the pollinators, the bacteria, the pet dogs, the livestock, something which is not obvious from the very beginning, because we as human beings are focused on something else, like the Olympic Games or football or a video of some cat that is rolling around and so on. So we might not lift our heads and look out into reality. And, just as we talked about the pollinators, if you are observant, I think you say in English. I had an example some weeks ago where I saw an interview with a Swedish famous comedian, and they were standing on, I think you say silo, a very tall building where they keep grain. And you saw the landscape out there, and the interview was done last year in August. And I realized, wow, there is only one color in the landscape. It's yellow. It used to be like a checkered board with different colors, but it's only one color. That's strange. But I knew the answer, because there are exceptions in the type of farm products which farmers would deliver. And nowadays, more and more of their work time goes to wheat, corn, and so on, not corn, sorry, wheat, I don't know the English for that, barley, and other such bread seed products, because they are wind pollinated. So they don't need any pollinators. And I've talked to farmers in Sweden, which immediately, without knowing who I am, say, oh, yeah, that's very good, because the pollinators are gone and we cannot have all these other crops. So we have wheat, barley, and so on. Rye. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Feeling sensation of reality. And of course, as a farmer, you have to adapt to changing environment. And this is the adaptation you can witness.
So, I mean, everything we are talking about is very concerning. And you get the strong impression that not enough is done in terms of financial means and pure just the willingness to look into it. So it brings me to another question, because I started this podcast because of my issues with the corona crisis and the role the industry plays in the decisions that are being taken. And in the medicine, we talk about regulatory capture, meaning the financial interests end up controlling the regulators which are supposed to regulate them, with the phenomenon of the revolving doors, like someone working for the FDA will end up with a very, very nice, well-paid position at Pfizer's just a few years later. Is it also the case, do we have evidence that the same is happening when it comes to telecommunications regulators? I heard also about the ICNIRP and other bodies which are supposed to regulate and ensure the safety of telecom radiation, which seem to be linked a little too closely to the industry. So what is your take on this?
I wish I could say no, there are not any such links, but no, there are so many links, unfortunately, and I'm always calling out the mature adult in the room, and there are very few of them, and no, it doesn't work really, and I'm just afraid again that greed will blind people. And very often you lack human, animal, plant, bacterial need on the table. And I remember, for instance, many years ago, I was in a meeting at the European Union, and there was one of the parliamentarians present, and we talked for a day about wireless telecommunication and the impact on society from all angles. Changing the landscape, changing the architecture of the cities and towns and villages, having impacts on personal as well as societal economy, etc., etc., etc. And of course, medical and biological effects, particularly medical ones. When we were through and people were getting up to leave, I shouted, "Oh, sorry, I have one final question I have to ask you." So people sat down again, and I said to the parliamentarian from the European Union, "Please tell us, when the European Union decided to opt for a general rollout of wireless telecommunication, what was the actual human need for that?" And then he laughed, and then he said to me the following, "Olle, that's probably the most intelligent question I've ever heard in the European Union. And the answer is very simple. There was no need, only greed. It was an industrial adventure that should yield profit. And everyone said yes, yes, yes to it. And no one even blinked for a second and said, well, maybe we should investigate medical and biological effects before rolling out. No. So it was greed-based. And that's interesting, because that also means that a lot of other things that are sold to us as being not only necessary and safe, but also something we should like and love, maybe are profit-driven more than need-driven. And again, the profit-driven projects have a tendency to bite you in your behind. So there could be a bill to be paid in the future. And I often get the question, especially from parents, is this safe for me and my child? And I always say, could I answer by asking you a counter question? And then I say, do you think there is a single insurance or reinsurance company in the world that has any form of responsibility and liability for health effects of electromagnetic fields? And they realize that no, there isn't. Is there any operator that takes responsibility from a legal point of view? No. Any manufacturer? No. Even the World Health Organization and Radiation Protection Boards have protected their backs. Yeah. So that's the answer. It's sold to but no one of the big players believe it is safe.
So indeed, the WHO admits that there are health risks.
Yeah.
The ICNIRP only bases, I mean, the famous regulation that are supposed to make us all safe are only based upon the thermal effects on the radiation. So it's very limited in its.
But don't forget the thermal regulation by ICNIRP based upon something called SAR, specific absorption rate. It is done in a laboratory which is completely radiation free. You have a plastic doll or mannequin filled with fluid and a probe, and then you expose this mannequin for 6, 10, or 30 minutes once in its lifetime and never again. And I repeat, in a completely radiation-free environment. Where do you find that in reality? And based upon the measurement, you arrive at the SAR measurement, and that is then used to say it's safe for you. Yeah. One thing, though, that should be mentioned, Paolo Vecchia, who was the head of ICNIRP, and I think this was the year 2008, if I remember correctly, when he was commenting upon the SAR values, he said to the audience in London at the meeting that these SAR measurements were never meant to be used as a medical or biological safety guideline. They're only technical in nature. They cannot be used as a protective shield for the industry, and it's not the last word on the topic. Fortunately, the day after, being at the Institute of Physics in London, he forgot that I was also there. And then he seemed to have forgotten what he said the day before. So,
yeah. So it's
I was
obvious.
Boy, I read cowboy and Indian books, and the Indians said that the white man spoke with a forked tongue, meaning they were lying. So, yeah, it seems to be changing information day to day, you know.
Is it true that the manufacturers themselves, if you actually look at the manual, which no one does, always recommend to keep the phones like at an arm's length from your body or
Yeah, and that goes back to a meeting in London in 2002. So that's 21 years ago. And at this meeting, the representatives of, for instance, Lloyd's UK, which is the largest insurance dealer in the world, Swiss Re, which is the largest reinsurance dealer, and a number of telecom companies were present. Then it was completely openly announced that the insurance and reinsurance companies did not take any form of responsibility. And then I remember there was a lawyer who addressed the telecom companies and said, well, the insurance and reinsurance companies have left you with the hot potato in your lap. So what are you going to do? And they were shocked. I could tell you the Swedish representative of Ericsson Telecommunication, he was whiter than snow in his face. I thought he was going to collapse in a heart attack, you know. It took them 5 years to come up with a solution to this hot potato, which is so simple, so smart. And as you said, in the instruction manuals up in this famous cloud where no one looks, you know, it says not an arm's length, but for a cell phone, at least 1 inch away from your body. And that means when you go to your shop, you buy the brand new cell phone in a cardboard box. You can look at it, but you cannot open the box and touch it, because then you have immediately violated the instructions from the manufacturers. And at the court of law, somewhere in the world, when you want to have compensation for your brain tumor or whatever it is, then the other side will just start by asking you, okay, when you used our cell phone, which hand did you use? Well, it was mostly the right hand. We told you you cannot. It says hold it 1 inch away from your body. and the hand is part of the body. It doesn't say an inch away from your head. It's from your body. So you can never, ever touch it, meaning that all the people out here in Sweden, they are already on the wrong side of this legal curve, you know. Smart, but at the same time, very telling to society. If I was the Prime Minister of Sweden, I would say, what the heck is going on? What is this?
So actually, all the information needed is here. You have manufacturers do not take responsibility. Insurers do not take responsibility. International bodies do say that it's harmful, like the WHO acknowledges that it is harmful. And we do have mechanisms of harms which have been shown in studies. We do have cases, reports, if not very obvious epidemiological data, we do have case reports, so it can harm individual people. We do have worrying epidemiological data when it comes to bees. So we have plenty of evidence, actually.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to. But then I have another question.
Back to London meeting in 2002, it should be remembered that representatives of the different insurance companies and so on, you know, they all said that for them it was not, and this is 2002, 21 years ago, for them it was not the question whether it was dangerous or not, the radiation. They knew it was dangerous. The only question for them was, in the future, who is going to pay for the party? And they didn't want to do it.
Fair enough. Who would want to do that?
No. Yeah, right.
When it comes to, I mean, again, I refer to the COVID situation where I'm coming from in terms of my podcasting. When it comes, for instance, to vaccine efficacy, even very rigorous critical science can be sometimes career ending. You are too critical of some pharmaceutical products. It's bad, you won't get grants, and sometimes it will end your career. I mean, you've been in that field for a long time. What has been your personal experience with the consequences? I mean, you mentioned the lack of funding. That is a given. But did you have other issues because you were such a vocal critic of the dangers of the technology?
Well, if I could be a bit pompous, I could say that my life could easily be turned into a Hollywood movie, because I have been through all of the things, including death threats and so on. And honestly, if I could relive my life, I would like to do something completely different. Maybe to become a Japanese kamikaze pilot or a crash dummy at Volvo car manufacturers, because it seems to be less risky. But at the same time, saying so, had I not entered this field, and that was actually through a radio program one evening in the laboratory many, many years ago, I would not have been able to speak to you. So there are upsides and downsides of every choice you make. But I'm still surprised that the mental fire brigade very often are very, very, very badly treated. You wouldn't throw stones at the ordinary fire brigade soldiers or spit at them or something, but people do that with scientists. And especially, as you say, if they come up with the wrong, in citation marks, the wrong data. And I remember in the beginning where we didn't find anything, everyone was happy. And then suddenly we started to find alterations in the skin of electrohypersensitive persons that didn't match this "it's all in your head" model. And then we felt an increasing opposition. And by the year, I would say 1995, it was a colossal wall which we couldn't breach. We were really heading towards disaster. But I tried to hang in and try to do as good as I can. because, when I die, I don't want to come to the pearly gates and St. Peter would say to me, but Olle, you saw it, you understood, you realized, why didn't you speak up? And then he will, pull the lever and I will down into hell. I didn't want that. It's all right if he says, oh, Olle, hello. I know you failed, but you did the best you could. And I was brought up in this, call it Christian sense, by my grandmother and mother. And they always said that never turn away from someone in need. So that's kind of my driving force. But of course, as I say, there has been obstacles that has hurt me a lot. And also people around me, of course, my family and so on, and the paid price is way too high. And I hope others will not have to endure this kind of situation.
Yeah, I watched one of your speeches, and towards the end of it, you were given an award by an hyper electrosensitive community, and I think maybe one of the good aspects of being truthful and staying with the science and being true to your ethics as well is that some people, and especially the vulnerable people, will notice it. Yeah. And I mean, they certainly looked like they were very grateful to the sacrifices that it meant.
Indeed. Yeah. And, it's not hard for an adult to imagine yourself being in that particular situation. It could be about electron hypersensitivity. It could be about an illness, poverty, war, isolation, whatever. And therefore, you need to reach out. And I remember Muhammad Ali, the famous boxer, he said something like, to pay respect to your fellow man, that's the rent you pay for your room while you're here on this planet. Very, very good said,
It is.
Yeah.
And I think it's a beautiful way to end our conversation. Actually, I think we covered decently most of the main aspects that I wanted to cover.
I agree. And if not, then you just come back, and your viewers and listeners, they should come back. And as I said before, if anyone would like to check out our website and donate, I would be very, very thankful for that. And even if they don't, I'm equally thankful, because after all, as I said, having chosen this path, I have met so many wonderful people and people that the scientist generally doesn't meet. We are generally very isolated in the ivory tower of science, and very few, if anyone, asks about any results, any data, any studies. But suddenly, when I came into this field, as I said before, we used to publish in Science, Nature, and so on about the brain, spinal cord, or whatever. No one called us. No one. Never, ever. And then we entered this field, and since then, the telephone has never gone silent,
Olle Johansson, dear professor, thank you. Thanks a lot. And I will be sure, of course, to link to your website so that hopefully some of those notoriously extremely rich Swiss people will give money to your project.